if you remember, if we go back to last class, we kind of picked up with pollution taxes. We talked about how those are a policy scheme in which the polluter is forced to pay a tax per unit of pollution that they discharge. This gives those polluters a signal about the cost of pollution. It sends them a signal that this activity that they're doing is costing society something above and beyond just what their firm's private costs are. And it forces the firm to have to think about how do I make my how do I arrange my production so that I'm not imposing an excess burden on society based on my production. They see the tax, they realize, okay, this is a harmful activity. Let me try to cut back when I can. But it also doesn't mandate any particular thing. It doesn't force the firm to act in any particular way. It gives them a choice of whether and how much they want to cut back on their pollution. They have a menu. They look at the menu. They say, okay, I have some pollution control options. They're going to have some combination of abatement costs as well as taxes on any remaining pollution that I have, and I'm going to try to choose the level of pollution that's going to minimize my own costs of abatement and my costs of the taxes I have to pay. So that's going to be a key concept that we kind of went over a little bit at the end of last class. A firm under a pollution tax scheme has two sources of costs. One of them is going to be the abatement cost that it has to undertake, the cost for the abatement that it has to undertake. And then for any pollution that remains, any pollution that it doesn't abate, it's going to have to pay taxes on that. And so both of those are costs, and you can think of the firm as trying to balance those against one another. As long as, if the abatement costs are cheaper than the tax burden, then it's going to want to cut back on its pollution and avoid the tax. If the tax burden is actually cheaper than the abatement cost that it would have to take on to cut its pollution, then it's actually going to prefer the tax, and it will just pay the tax rather than cut back on pollution. And this is going to eventually, a tax scheme like this is going to lead to, we had a previous equal marginal principle where we had marginal reduction costs or marginal costs of reduction equal to marginal damages. That was kind of the equal marginal principles for efficiency. That's what we saw in the microeconomics section. That's what we saw when we were thinking about the optimal level of pollution or the efficient level of pollution. We want the marginal cost of reducing the pollution to equal the marginal benefits of reducing the pollution. There is a similar kind of principle, not for efficiency, this was for efficiency, but there's a similar principle for the other concept that we talked about, which was cost effectiveness. So for cost effectiveness, we have that the marginal cost of reduction at all sources of pollution are the same. And in fact, these will all be equal to each other, and they'll all be equal to the tax rate. And I'll explain a little bit why it's the case that each individual firm is going to choose a level of pollution that will equate the tax rate to its marginal cost of reduction, and why it's the case that when all firms are doing that, when all firms are equating their marginal cost of reduction to the tax rate, why that leads to the lowest cost. I have a couple diagrams I want to show to illustrate that idea. The first one is right here. So in yellow, I have what is the tax burden of the firm when it, for example, reduces pollution from Q max to Q1. The tax burden is given by the rectangle, which is sort of the product of the tax rate times the quantity of pollution. So this on the x-axis, this is the pollution level. So any extra movement to the right is additional pollution. Any movement to the left is cutting back on pollution. So Q1 is the level of pollution in this diagram. T is the tax rate. So T times Q1 is the tax burden. That's the yellow rectangle. And then the abatement costs for the firm are the sort of the turquoise area underneath the marginal abatement cost curve, or marginal cost of reduction curve. So it's going to have some tax burden and also some abatement costs, right, in response to the tax. So I have here that the firm chose Q1. Why is it advantageous for the firm to respond in that fashion? Why is it going to set quantity of pollution such that the marginal cost of reduction is equal to the tax? Let's consider what would happen if it chose something other than Q1. Let's say it chose something other than equating MCR to the tax rate. So in the event that it chose, again, this is marginal cost of reduction. let's say that instead it didn't choose Q1, it chose Q2. Okay, if it chooses Q2, it pays the taxes equal to T times Q2, which is that yellow rectangle, and it incurs abatement costs equal to the area below the MCR between Qmax and Q2, which is given by the turquoise lines. Okay, so this actually, if you look closely, you'll notice that this has an extra bit of costs right here sticking up above the marginal cost of reduction curve, which the firm was actually able to avoid that. It was actually able to avoid that extra cost if it increased its pollution reduction a little bit more to Q1. So if we switch back, I'm going to switch back to the previous slide. There in that case, there are no extra costs kind of sticking up here above the graph there. Those are eliminated in the case where you go all the way to Q1. Whereas if you only stop at Q2 and only reduce your pollution to Q2, you have to incur a little bit higher cost. If you notice, the total area, the yellow area plus the turquoise area, is larger under Q2 than it is under Q1. Q1, it's actually able to reduce its cost lower than it does at Q2. That's a case where the firm is polluting a little bit too much relative to what it should under the tax. We can also think of the case where the firm is reducing a little bit too much relative to the tax. So let's say that we still have the tax rate T, but instead of stopping at Q1, the firm reduces all the way to Q3. Let's say it just can't help itself. It loves pollution control so much, it just goes all the way to Q3. And in that case, the tax burden is, again, given by the rectangle that's shaded in yellow. That's T times Q3. And then again, the abatement cost burden is the area below the marginal cost of reduction curve between Qmax and the level that it stops at, which is Q3. So that entire area below the MCR that's shaded in turquoise, that's all the abatement costs. And if you'll notice that, again, we have a little bit of extra area up top here, which was not present when we stopped at Q1 rather than going to Q3. This area above here is extra cost that the firm is having to take on, which is not present if we go back to, say, this example where it's polluting Q1. Okay, Q1 is, in this case, minimizes the total costs, abatement cost plus the tax burden, because if it pollutes a little bit more, it has to pay more tax, and the tax burden in this case exceeds the abatement costs that it saves. Whereas in this third example with Q3, it doesn't reduce enough. It pays less tax, but it actually incurs higher abatement costs than the tax that it would otherwise have to pay. So if you look closely, the tax that it would have to pay for the units between Q3 and, say, Q1 that we had before, the tax that it would have to pay, this was Q1, the tax that it would have to pay in that case is just this yellow extra rectangle, whereas the cost to the firm of abating the pollution is this entire sort of, it's not exactly a trapezoid, it's kind of a funny shaped polygon here. This entire thing here is what the firm pays in terms of extra abatement costs from going from Q1, if it wants to go from Q1 to Q3. Okay, so that's kind of an intuitive graphical argument for why it's efficient that the firm will set Q such that marginal cost of reduction equals the tax rate. This sort of three-panel diagram, these three cases I went over, is kind of a graphical, intuitive argument for why it's efficient for the firm to set a quantity of pollution such that their marginal cost of reduction is equal to the tax rate. Okay, let's think about what happens if two firms have different marginal costs of reduction. Let's say they're polluting at different levels and their marginal costs of reduction are different. So source one over here, I have reducing all the way to Q1. Its marginal costs of reduction are relatively high. Let's think about source two, where marginal costs of reduction are low because it's polluting at a lower level. Okay, so these MCRs are not equal to each other between these two firms. And so let's see what happens when when we can reallocate pollution between them. If MCR is not equal across the two firms, it's possible to reallocate pollution from one to the other and actually reduce overall costs. And so that happens. We could have source one actually not reduce as much. We could have source one actually pollute a little bit more. We could have source two pollute a little bit less. We could maintain pollution at the same level by just having source one pollute a little bit more, source two cut back by exactly the same amount extra that source one was increasing. And source one would save the costs equal to this sort of trapezoid here that's shaded in green. Source one would save that costs, and source two would increase its own costs by the amount that's shaded in orange there. And you can see because source one has climbed up higher on its marginal cost of production curve, it saves more abatement costs than source two incurs when source two increases its pollution. Okay, so again, this is kind of just an intuitive argument for why it's efficient for these two sources to be polluting at a level where their marginal costs of reduction are equal to one another. So it's efficient. Again, this is just the result that we had before. It's efficient for these two sources to be polluting such that their marginal costs of reduction are equal to each other. I should say it's cost effective. It's cost effective to do that because we can achieve any target that we want at lowest cost if it's the case that the marginal cost of reductions at these two sources are equal to each other. Theoretically, that's what defines cost effectiveness, is to have this condition here, MCR1 equals MCR2 equals MCR3 equals MCRN equals the tax rate. That's the cost effective. That's sort of the cost effectiveness equal marginal principle. Okay, so that's kind of some of the mechanics and the intuition for how firms respond to pollution taxes and how that leads to how a pollution tax can lead to a cost-effective outcome. I want to just briefly talk about here tradable permits, which is an alternative mechanism for reducing pollution. So instead of, whereas with a pollution tax, what you're doing is you're giving polluters a choice according to how much they want to pollute and how much taxes they want to pay. With tradable permits, you're not giving them a tax. You're simply allocating a fixed and scarce amount of pollution permits or allowances, or you're giving them permission to a certain extent to pollute some, but you're limiting that at some level. And you allow trading. So this is different than an emission standard or a performance standard, because the performance standard or emission standard applied to everybody, all polluters uniformly. They all had to meet the same standard. They were all required to cap their pollution at a certain level. Whereas a tradable permit scheme says, here's some permission, here's a permit, here's some permission to pollute, and you could either pollute if you want, or you can decide not to pollute, and you can sell that permission to somebody else who maybe values it more than you. And whenever you're selling pollution, that is reducing the pollution at one source, increasing at another, and overall the overall level of pollution is maintained after a sale of a permit, because one person is forfeiting their right to pollute, another is acquiring the right to pollute, but on average, overall, there's no net increase in pollution. So this permit scheme allows for a constant level of pollution, but it allows firms to reallocate that pollution among themselves in a way that achieves that pollution target at lower cost than otherwise if there was no flexibility for allowing trading. And so that's this thing that I had drawn up here. This is kind of a graphical example of maybe like a trade where source two would trade some of its permits. It would say, I'm going to give up some of my permits. I'm going to reduce pollution a little bit more than I have to, and sell that to source one, and source one is going to acquire that permit and then pollute a little bit more than it's allowed to, because it's acquired an additional permit. So this, a pollution trade is kind of illustrated a little bit by this this example here with these two this two source example. So this these permit schemes were this was used to very great success in the United States in the 1990s to control sulfur dioxide, and so the U.S. government, they distributed permits to pollute sulfur dioxide to large coal-fired power plants and other kinds of industrial facilities that emitted sulfur dioxide. It distributed permits to those sources, and it allowed them to trade with each other, and that trading led to lower cost sources doing a little bit more pollution reduction because it was cheaper to do it there, and it led higher cost sources to sell some of their permits to the lower cost sources, or sorry, to buy some permits from the lower cost sources in order to not have to reduce as much, because the high cost sources had very costly abatement, the low cost sources had very cheap abatement, and they could sort of reallocate among themselves to achieve a lower compliance cost, a lower cost of meeting that target. So this scheme was employed to great effect in the 1990s for reducing sulfur dioxide pollution. So just a quick example of how this works. Let's say that we have two firms, each polluting 50 units. That's their baseline emissions. So this leads to 100 units discharged altogether. But let's say that we only want 60 units of pollution. We don't want 100. We would like to cut back by 40 tons in some way. And let's also assume, this is a little bit critical as well, let's also assume that pollution is uniformly mixed, and that we don't care so much which firm is doing the polluting. We only care about the total amount. We don't care about how much the first one is doing relative to the second. Okay, so one thing that we might do here, if we wanted to implement a permit scheme, is we could give some initial right to pollute to each firm. We could let them each pollute 30 tons. So they initially were at 50. We could say you have to each cut back by 20 tons. So you have the right to pollute 30, and so you have a mandate to reduce by 20. And then depending on what their marginal cost curves look like, it might make sense for them both to stay at 30 tons of pollution. But if there's any difference in terms of how they're able to abate their pollution, it might make sense for actually one of those firms to reduce a little bit more and have the other reduce a little bit less. And that's what is sort of exemplified by this diagram here, which is, if you remember from the user cost concepts and the intertemporal resource allocation concepts, this is actually this setup here, this two pollution source setup is actually analogous to the resource allocation problem that we had when we were considering how to allocate a resource over time. Okay, so the x-axis here is in units of pollution reduced. So if firm one is reducing large amounts of pollution, if firm one is trying to cut back on 40 units of pollution, that's going to be very costly. Whereas if firm one is reducing nothing, then its marginal costs are going to be small. So marginal costs increase marginal reduction costs increase as you reduce more and more pollution. This is the same kind of pattern that we've observed before. That was the firm one case. Firm two is kind of going in the other direction. Firm two starts at 0 units of reduction on the right, and as firm two increases its reduction, its costs are going to go up, and its costs are actually a lot steeper than they go up at a much steeper rate than firm one's costs. So let's consider that we have some initial allocation, which is here at 2020. This was what we said on the previous slide. Each firm is only allowed to pollute 30 units, and so they each have to reduce 20 units. So this is where the initial allocation falls, is at 2020. And notice at 2020, the marginal cost of reduction for firm two is a lot higher than it is at firm one. The next unit of reduction at firm two is a lot more expensive than the next unit of reduction at firm one, which, if we remember from a couple slides ago, that suggests that there's an opportunity to reallocate pollution between the sources and actually reduce costs overall. Okay, so firm two has high costs of reduction, firm one has low costs, and so it actually makes sense to shift this allocation a little bit more to the right so that firm 1 is doing more reduction, firm 2 is doing less, so that more reduction is taking place at the firm that has lower costs. And so, if you reduce pollution a little bit, you can maintain the same level, but just reallocate it a little bit more. You start to narrow the gap between these marginal costs of reduction. If you go to the right a little bit more, firm 1's marginal reduction costs increase, firm 2's marginal reduction costs decrease, but there's still a gap, so we want to go a little bit further to the right. And eventually we get to a point where those two costs are the same. And that would be at this allocation of 30 units of reduction at firm 1 and 10 units of reduction at firm 2. All right, and in the process of that, we save all this money through the increase of pollution at firm 1 and the decrease of pollution at firm 2. The increase of pollution at firm 2, decrease of pollution at firm 1, increase in reduction at firm 1, decrease in the reduction at firm 2. We save money along the way because of the fact that firm 2 had such higher costs to reduce that pollution from its initial point, and it had higher costs for each of these units until we get to the sweet spot here at an allocation of 30 and 10. That allows you to capture all those cost savings associated with that area D. So area D represents the cost savings of reallocating from an equal split to a split in which firm 1 does more reduction and firm 2 does a little bit less reduction. Okay, so that's an example. That's a case of a kind of graphical example of how this permit scheme can reduce overall costs while maintaining the same level of pollution, because the level of pollution is still 40 units. 30 and 10 is still 40 units of pollution as it was before. We had 20 and 20 before, that was 40 units. Now we have 30 and 10, which is the same level. It's just that we've been able to save some abatement costs as a result of this reallocation. So let me just go back, and I skipped over some of this. I want to return to some of the advantages and disadvantages of taxes and permits. So taxes, remember, taxes are giving polluters a choice. You say, here's an option to pollute if you wish, but if you pollute, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you some amount per unit of your pollution to emit that pollution. So it allows flexibility. It also allows incentives to innovate, because the firm is getting essentially rewarded for finding new ways of reducing pollution, or finding new innovations, finding new techniques to reduce its pollution. It's getting rewarded in the sense that it can reduce its overall tax burden if it finds new ways of reducing pollution. So it's got a direct incentive to innovate. Recall that was not the case for the technology mandates or the emissions standards or performance standards, because in those cases, you only got rewarded for complying with the particular standard that the government gave. You only got rewarded by either installing the technology and not having to get the steep penalties or sanctions from the government for not installing the technology. So you're only rewarded to the extent that you complied precisely with the law. With emission standards, you were rewarded for getting up to the standard, but you didn't get any additional rewards for going beyond the standard if you were able to. But in this case, if you go beyond the standard, or if you go beyond what you were able to do before, if you innovate and you're able to produce more pollution than you were before, you can reduce your own tax burden as a result of reducing that pollution. So you directly benefit as a firm. You directly stand to benefit as a result of going beyond what maybe you could before, because you can avoid taxes. Those are some of the advantages. Some of the disadvantages. Some of the disadvantages are that you don't actually know in advance, unless you know exactly what the firm's cost curves are. You don't know in advance what people are going to what the firms are going to actually end up polluting at the end of the day. You don't know exactly how much pollution control is going to be undertaken, because it's up to the firm. Again, it's sort of up to the firm to decide whether it makes sense for them to continue reducing pollution beyond what it already has done, or whether it prefers to pollute more and just pay the tax. You don't know exactly how much control is going to be undertaken. So that can lead to uncertainty in the overall level of pollution. You also don't know the distribution of the pollution. So if you have you have a number of polluters, maybe some of these polluters, maybe the circles here, maybe the circles here are very low, are very high cost polluters, and the squares are low cost polluters. So if you have these dispersed throughout a city or through some urban area or some region, if the circles are high cost polluters, they might not reduce any pollution from the tax, but the square firms will reduce pollution from the tax, and so you get lots of emissions, lots of soot, lots of smoke, lots of sulfur dioxide at the around the areas around the circles. But then the areas around the squares will be relatively clean, and so you can get what's called hotspots, where some areas, some industries might have particularly high abatement costs and have a particularly hard time reducing their pollution, and you get high concentrations of pollution around those firms, whereas other industries might have a low abatement costs, and you get lots of cleanup there. So the total level of pollution is reduced, but that occurs at the expense of having very high concentrations around particular zones. So that's one potential drawback of pollution taxes, is uncertainty about the overall level, and also potentially having hotspots. The tradable permits, it turns out, has the same potential problem with hotspots. So there's also the fact that you can get hotspots because, again, if some firms have low costs and some have high costs, some firms are going to be selling their permits to others. Other firms are then going to be buying the permits from the first firms, and so they're going to be increasing their pollution. And again, you can get a situation where the firms that acquire the permits they're polluting a lot. The firms that sell the permits are polluting a lot less, and so you get these blotches maybe on the landscape where there's lots of pollution in certain areas. Advantages of permits is that you actually you know what target you're hitting, you know what aggregate target you're hitting, you know that overall in the economy you're going to be hitting a certain pollution target. You're going to be achieving a certain level of control or a certain level of cleanup, and that's going to be happening at least cost. But it's possible that by putting a strict cap on the overall level of pollution, that cap might end up, I guess there's a couple things that could happen. One thing that could happen is that cap might end up being extremely expensive to meet. And if you don't know exactly what the polluter's abatement costs are, that cap could put a very high burden on polluters, and the control costs could be excessively high and excessively burdensome if that cap is set at a very strict level. And you could end up with permit prices being very high and firms overall having a very high control costs. But the advantage of that is that you know exactly how much pollution you're going to be getting. You know exactly how much aggregate pollution is going to be happening because you've distributed exactly a certain amount of pollution permits. Okay, so that's the advantage. On the flip side, then the advantage is that you know that you're achieving some level. So if you know that it's important not to go over some threshold for emissions, then the tradable permits policy is actually advantageous because the tradable permits policy actually sets the aggregate level at a particular amount, whereas the tax doesn't. The tax doesn't set the level at any particular amount. It just sets the price and lets firms pollute as they wish according to that price. Whereas the tradable permit policy sets an aggregate limit, and if you know that it's important to stay below some limit, you might be more inclined to choose a tradable permits policy in order to achieve that limit, and make sure that you're not going over that limit.